Hello and welcome to It's Not for Nothing, a podcast on untangling the mess of grief, faith, trauma, and hope after the death of a child. We are three Catholic mothers carrying the extraordinary cross of child loss. If you too are grieving a child, we want to provide a safe place for you to come just as you are, while sharing the encouragement that our God is on the move in the wasteland of your grief. You and your suffering are both precious to Him. It's not for nothing. We're so glad you're here. Hello and welcome back to It's Not for Nothing. I'm Elizabeth Leon, the Director of Family Support with Red Bird Ministries, and we're here for episode 38, Dads Grieve Too. In time for Father's Day, an opportunity to really expand our conversation and make sure we're giving special attention to the dads that are holding so much love and grief in their hearts. And I'm so happy today to be welcomed by two men. You might be noticing this is normally a podcast that has at least more than one woman on it, but today it's just me here with two really wonderful Redbird dads. We're so happy to have both of them here with us. I'm so grateful to have Edward Luersman here with us. He is the co-founder of Blessed Are They Grief Counseling in Central Ohio, near Columbus. And we also have Brian Laspisa. He's a Redbird leader and a bereaved father from Phoenix, Arizona. So gentlemen, we're so happy to have you here. Welcome.
Very happy to be here.
I'm wondering if you maybe could each say a little bit about where you are in the world and how you ended up on a grief podcast.
So we live in Phoenix, Arizona. My wife, Janice, and I have been married for a little over 12 years. We met through the RCIA program at Arizona State. I went through it with her brother. Her brother introduced us. She went through RCIA, and then we got married there. So we're still relatively new to the faith, but it's a very big part of our life. We have 4 living children at home, which I'm still getting used to having to make that clarification. In 2022, we were pregnant with our 5th child, Joseph, and some complications arose in the pregnancy that threatened Janice's life. And unfortunately, our son did not survive that procedure. And we found so much healing through Redbird. It's been such a huge part of our life. And it's a group that we wish we didn't have to be a part of, but now that we've been a part of it, we're so thankful to be here.
And we're thankful for you, Brian. Thank you. I know you've been a really instrumental leader in the men's part of Redbird. So thank you. And Edward, we're so glad you're here. Tell us about yourself.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I am the owner and a licensed professional clinical counselor with Blessed Are They Grief Counseling and LLC in Ohio. And so I'd say the first reason why I'm here is because it's my specialty and my passion to work with individuals and couples throughout Ohio who are dealing with either infertility, pregnancy loss, infant loss, or also the hidden grief of being single and grieving not having a spouse or children. So I do a lot of work, and it's a great privilege to accompany people, but also personally, going through the journey of both infertility and childlessness, my wife and I not having any children with us, and then several pregnancy losses, which is why I'm here today, is as a father of loss myself. Been a great privilege to accompany others and make meaning and purpose in my suffering through accompanying others. So, and it's a great privilege to partner with Red Bird Ministries. And so, yeah, that's why I'm here.
Well, welcome. We try to bring in the male perspective once in a while. For better, for worse, more women step forward for support. But that's exactly why we need to have conversations like this, because dads grieve too. We know that. We're actually having a dad's grief support night coming up called the Silent Cross, which I think is really indicative of how many men grieve, and your grief is just as important. So we're going to talk more about that today. And I want to introduce our scripture from 2 Samuel chapter 19, verse 1. The king was shaken, King David in this case. The king was shaken and went up to the room over the city gate and wept. He said as he wept, "My son Absalom, my son Absalom. If only I had died instead of you, Absalom, my son, my son." And I love that scripture because it is truly the lament of a father. I'm almost feeling all choked up going through that, like the repetitive nature of my son, a father's heart just crying out over and over again, not just the absence of this life that he cherished so much, but I imagine also the grief of not being able to protect your child from death or your family from the impact of death. So, as we dive in, perhaps each of you could share a little bit about your grief, what you needed, how you found support, what worked, what didn't work.
Initially, we actually ended up in the hospital a couple times, so it was kind of a roller coaster at the beginning. The first time I ended up in the hospital was during COVID. So the lovely part of grief of that was I wasn't able to be there with Janice. She was in the ER all by herself, not knowing what was going on. It was very hard. I remember just pacing around the hospital, and I got a call from our doctor, and he said the baby's fine. And it was like, okay, there was this big release there, and we went back home. And, at that point, I really put on the dad hat and said, okay, we're going to get through this. You're going to stay in bed. I'm going to do everything, and it was kind of double duty. And I probably drove Janice a little nuts being, the Mr. Fix-It dad. I'm going to take care of this and make sure it's okay. And then a few weeks later, we ended up in the hospital again. And that's when we had found out that she had what's called placenta precreta. And we had our previous children were all born via C-section. And her internal organs were being threatened by her placenta. I know a lot more about this than I ever did before and even cared to ever know, but it's helpful to understand the context that we were going through. So our doctor, who's also a deacon, I very specifically remember he came into the room and basically told us what had to happen to save her. She needed to have an emergency hysterectomy, and Joseph was 20 weeks at the time, and he was not old enough to survive that procedure. And so I had to say the words that were going to save my wife, but also would lead to the death of my son. And it was, very hard not being able to protect him and knowing that, what we were doing is what was necessary to save her, but that he wasn't going to be able to come out of it. And God gave us many consolations along the way. And through this journey, I think the biggest thing that came out of it was I had made my fatherhood into an idol. It was basically the very foundation of my identity. I was the crazy Catholic guy at work who, kept having kids every 2 years. And when people would ask me, well, how many do you want to have? And I said, well, as many as God would give us. But this isn't what I meant. I meant as many as I wanted, as long as God kept blessing us, and not, this is a very tangible way of saying, oh, okay, God, this is your plan. This is what we're having for children. But it was a lot harder to say it on that side. And the evil one definitely found a chink in the armor and definitely attacked me hard after this. So I think, again, God taking this really dark time and kind of reorienting me back to his fatherhood and not basing my life so much on my fatherhood. I think that's a big part of the grief journey. And, I think a lot of this healing came from Red Bird. We first attended a couples workshop here in Phoenix. It was nice to know we weren't alone. There were other couples going through similar things. There was other dads there. Then my wife attended the mom's retreat. I attended the dad's retreat, and it just is amazing what has been able to come out of that. And I think when I attended the dad's retreat, I kind of caught Ryan off guard a little bit because I was excited to go. I saw what happened at the couples retreat. I saw what happened for Janice, and was just very excited to go and do this. And now I'm at the point where I want to talk about this to everybody. We just finished a golf tournament here, and sharing our story now is a huge part of my healing journey, being able to talk about it and help walk with other people through what they're going through, knowing that our journeys aren't the same, but I think there's little tidbits that can come out of what we've gone through that can help them, because we don't have it all figured out. I don't have it all figured out. There's still days when something still prompts the grief to come back. Maybe it's the end of a Disney movie that, the family gets all back together and it's like, well, there's something missing here. And I can feel myself starting to, tear up. But when we lost our son, we felt a little bit of the pain of the crucifixion. And now being on the other side of it, we can feel a little bit of the joy of that resurrection that only God could bring out of such a dark time.
Wow. Well, Brian, thank you. That's such a powerful story, and one that we can really hear the rawness of it, but also you're sharing the Paschal mystery of it, that you are not still although sometimes at times all of us are at Good Friday, but you are experiencing hope and healing. And I really think the joy and the purpose that comes from seeing how the Lord is using your suffering, it's not for nothing is the name of this podcast for a reason, that the Lord doesn't cause it, but he does use it. And your story has a lot of complexities. It's not just that Joseph died. It's that what you imagined for your life died, and you and Janice losing fertility, the additional grief of the perception of there being a choice, when in fact there really was no choice. It was either you lose them both or you lose him. But that's muddy ground. That's ground where the enemy is gonna want to like wade in there and mess with feelings and grief. And also, your beautiful honesty of how fatherhood had become an idol.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I'm so sorry to hear about your difficult journey, Brian. That was very touching to hear your story, and I'm so sorry that it was such a traumatic experience. So, very differently, but also similarly, as you were talking, Brian, about losing a baby during COVID, and the grief and the trauma of not being there with your wife. Unfortunately, that part of it's very similar to my own experience. And my wife and I, when we lost our first pregnancy in March of 2020, just as COVID was coming down, it was early and in the pregnancy, but also we were going to the ER because the OB was thinking that it was an ectopic pregnancy. And the hospital, which will remain unnamed, they asked, "Are you 16 weeks?" And we said no. And then they were like, "Well, you can't come in. You're not far enough along to come into the hospital because of COVID." So similar to you, Brian, I was relegated to the parking garage and just left there, waiting powerless, to do anything, just waiting for any update, any text, any call. That was probably one of the hardest parts of that loss experience, was not being there, wondering what's going to happen. Is she going to have to go into surgery? Are we going to lose one of her fallopian tubes? We're already concerned about her fertility as is. That was very, very difficult and was very much traumatic, in addition to just the grief of we've been pregnant for such a short amount of time, and now it looks like we're losing the baby. And in addition to the sadness, the devastation, at time the numbness, there was also kind of a weird in time a sense of relief of I can actually call myself a father now, because up to that point I didn't know how to relate with that, or if I could relate with that identity. I'm a father.
Yeah.
Even though I can't meet my baby, we can name her, we can pray for her. That's an identity that I have now. So and then we went through a period of about 5 years of not conceiving again. And then actually very recently we had a series of another couple of miscarriages, and so unexpected and out of the blue. But it's just been an interesting journey, and ours, with it being merged with the infertility, has been especially challenging when you deal with an empty what was supposed to be a nursery and never became a nursery. Our sad room is what we call it. But moving helped. Then you're like, we're not going to have a sad room in this house. But empty arms, it's just a different kind. What was really helpful was the refuge of some of those relationships where people were very supportive, very empathetic, people who were sending us flowers, bringing over meals when it happened. And it was weird because it was COVID, right? Like all of us were isolated, right? So sometimes it was like drop-offs on our front porch, things like that. But people who were thinking of us and were realizing that, wow, this is a really difficult time for you. Some of the challenges that I've experienced is, sometimes when you hope that certain people in your life are going to support you in a certain way, and then to find that, like, for whatever reason, they're not able to meet you where you're at or how you'd like them to. It's just been a very big growing experience to learn, where is that support, where is that refuge, what are fair expectations for people, things like that. So it's taught me a lot of lessons, like Brian was saying, that I didn't really want to learn or seek out, but it's good that we're learning from our grief and trauma experiences and trying to heal, to grow, grow more resilient, things like that.
Yeah. It was big for me to meet other men like you that have gone through this. All the support at the beginning was great. There was a lot of friends that came out, and wanted to support us. Finding people in this group, in the Red Bird family that have gone through this, when they say, I'm so sorry, it's like taken up another level because they do know what you're walking through. And again, it's not taking anything away from the people that were there to support us. We're so thankful for all the people that helped us there at the beginning. But like you said, at some point, they almost have to go back to their normal when we have a whole new normal. And that new normal is kind of a string that holds it all together. So being able to find that community that really does understand, even though all of our stories are unique, understands the weight of this cross has just been absolutely life-changing.
Yeah, and I love, Edward, hearing you talk about your willingness to step into your identity as father. I mean, I think especially when we talk about pregnancy loss, in a secular, worldly sense, that can be very murky for people, especially with outright destruction or minimization of life in the womb. It's easily overlooked, the role of father in pregnancy loss. But I love your declaration of claiming this as your identity, because of course that is the truth. That is what is real. But that's just an important reminder for our fathers who are only fathers to souls who are already in heaven. And also the unique cross of that secondary infertility. Like I've heard from moms who have said when they got pregnant after years of infertility only to miscarry, like confusion and anger at God too, of like, it would be better just to be infertile, but you gave us these children again. And then, you sort of took them away. That's in air quotes, because we know that's not exactly how God works. Can you speak at all to that nature of the grief, of the blessing being so fleeting after years of infertility?
Yeah, I would say that was probably one of the more difficult parts of going through the series of pregnancy losses was, is this our miracle? Is this finally, a breakthrough after so long? Where we went through so many surgeries, we went through so many treatments to try to help, naturally improve our fertility and to help God make that miracle happen. And to get to the end of the road of that, to have our doctors kind of just basically like, well, I'm sorry, but we've basically done all we can. All of a sudden, a miracle happens, and then have it taken away. It is very difficult. It's really discouraging, to kind of think that you did all you could and yet still ended up in a loss. That right to say, what was the point of this? Why couldn't we have just avoided the whole heartache of all of this, right?
And in time stepping into that unique mission that those souls have. We know that those souls that you didn't get to meet, that were unique new creations by the Lord, are eternal, and you'll meet them someday. But it's such a mystery for how the Lord uses these brief, beautiful, eternal lives to bring his plan into the world.
And it's a bit of a process to get to that realization, because I 100% agree with that, Elizabeth, right? That is the truth of it. And I would not exchange anything for my baby's existence. But in the heat of the moment, when the emotions are raw, the grief is raw, we don't always feel that way, right? Sometimes we have those emotions like, why did this happen to me? But to me, it's okay if it takes time to kind of wrestle with all of that and get to those kind of conclusions where it makes more sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It becomes almost, God, I've done this, 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 and this, and this for you. Why did you let this happen? And can very easily, turn in on yourself and become very angry towards God. Why couldn't you have just had us avoid this? And, looking back, all the things that have come into our life since Joseph died is just, it's hard to say I wouldn't want to trade them, because obviously I would love to have my son here in my arms with me. But to think of all the people we've met through this, all the things we've been able to do, and how God has steered it back, it sounds weird to say, but it like almost makes it worth it. And again, it's weird to say, not wanting to trade Joseph for that, but he's still such a part of our life, has brought so many people in that it truly is that weird both and of Catholicism, like the sorrow, but the joy at the same time, and often because of each other.
Yes, that great paradox. And I think even the reality that just because perhaps you have moved through that time, it's been 7 years for us, to a place of joy, peace, acceptance, gratitude even, doesn't mean I'm not still always the humanly grieving mother. I might now also be the spiritually enlightened grief leader. but I get to be both. And we all do in our journey. We don't exchange one for the other.
Well, and I think that's, again, what makes Red Bird so powerful is the accompaniment and the fact that you can be real about that. It's not, this facade you put on of, hey, we've got this all figured out. There's no sadness. No, there's days when I feel like curling up in the corner and not wanting to go anywhere. And that's okay. And there's other days when I can use the story to help other people. And both of these items coexist with each other. And it's beautiful.
That's such a powerful thing. I'm so glad you articulated that so well for anyone listening to this. I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit. How has grief changed your role as a father?
The biggest part is through it kind of trying to reorient my life back to God and not to my fatherhood, back to his perfect fatherhood. Again, still a work in progress, as it will be until, this side of heaven, but reorienting back towards that. And it's brought to life many of the things that I took for granted, or maybe another facet to them. I pray the rosary. I try to do it every day. Two of the mysteries that have really spoken to me since we lost Joseph are the presentation and the finding in the temple. So in the presentation, Mary and Joseph take Jesus, present him to God in the temple. We kind of have to do that too with our pregnancies, with our children. Hey, you gave me this child. I give it back to you as you wish. But as part of that presentation, there was also, hey, through your heart, a sword will pierce. We like to kind of ignore that part a little bit, but that, losing our son has really brought that to life. But then the finding in the temple, Jesus stayed behind. Mary and Joseph were very anxious, which is an interesting thing to reflect on, considering that one of the two people is the Blessed Mother, who is a perfect human being. So for her to be anxious, it also allows us room to be a little anxious. And this side of heaven, we will be anxious looking for our children. We continue to be like, we want them here. I remember very clearly one day reflecting on it, and they find Jesus in the temple, and he says, "Did you not know I must be in my Father's house?" One day we will get to heaven, see our children, and they will say, "Did you not know I must be in my Father's house?" And, that has been a very powerful reminder that difficult as this time of grief is, it's not the end. It's not the final chapter of the story.
Well, and I love the permission you give to be human and holy. No one holier than the Blessed Mother. And yet I've clung to that verse as well. And yet she experienced the human emotion of anxiety. So we get to have both of those experiences.
Yeah. So in addition to thinking about, my gratitude for being able to be father of my three children, I also think about how different that father relationship looks as what it could have. I don't want to get too caught on like the hypotheticals, but just, recognizing that naming my children, continuing to pray for them, ask regularly for their intercession, having masses said for them. My fathering looks different than what it would in another context. And that's okay. That's what makes sense for the situation. I want to make the most and love my kids the most that I can as is possible. So yeah, it just looks different than what I envisioned when I said I do, 7 years ago.
Yeah, and it's funny because people that don't know this experience could look at those of us that are continuing this enduring connection with our children that have gone before us as staying in grief somehow. If you keep bringing them up, or you're living in the past, you haven't moved on, any of those things that people say when they don't really understand. But I love how you're really connecting this enduring connection with being an intentional father. Like every time you remember, you honor, you bring up these children that you've been gifted with, you're fathering them. You're continuing your role of being the shepherd of how they are in the world. What about your marriages? I mean, we know that grief has an impact on a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, and therefore on your dynamic together. Can you say anything about your experience of moving through marriage and grief?
We were blessed early on to have some of those people that are close to us recommend that we see a counselor, because this isn't something that, as much as we support each other, like being in the midst of this mess, we're not going to be able to quote unquote fix anything, both individually, and then a few times we went and saw the counselor together. And I think that was big, to be able to work through some of these things. with a third party rather than, me trying to project how I'm processing the grief on her and her projecting it on me. We process things differently. And, I think the thing I'm most thankful for is she gave me the space to be okay being an emotional mess. I could feel guilty about that at times, just break into tears for like no reason. But she was there, and even though she was hurting so bad, she gave me the room to be able to do that. And so I think, only by the grace of God, this whole situation has helped to make us stronger in our marriage, and know that, like you kind of talked about, when you say those vows for better or for worse, like you try to ignore the worst part. Let's just do the better. But sometimes the worst brings out the better. That's, part of our experience is that we've been able to process this together and allow each other the room that we need to do it. That's not to say there weren't bumps along the way. I was probably a little pushy toward Janice, go do this, go do that, because that's, as the band, we want to fix it. Okay, where's the instruction book? Like, how do we do this? And, she was very patient with me, and we worked through it together on our own time. And, I think we're a lot better for it.
And thank you so much, Brian, for saying, how helpful it was for you guys to seek counseling. I think people, but especially men, need to hear that. And I know I'm a biased source on this. As a licensed counselor, like, I get it that, like, I have a conflict of interest here. But that is such an important message, that outside support is so helpful when you're going through something so heavy, so difficult, something that strains and tries your marriage in a way that you never expected would happen with your own marriage. So thank you for your courage in getting that individual and couple support. And it's really good that you were seeking that, try almost a little more proactively before it became a marriage crisis, if you will, because sometimes when left unaddressed, these things fester and get worse and worse. And next thing you know, you're in a situation where couples are at each other and there's so much contempt or distance or coldness, that it becomes really hard to reverse course once there's been so much hurt and so much pain.
I think part of the reason we were able to do that is early on, I went into fix mode as a man, like, okay, we're still in the hospital. What do we need to do for the funeral? What do we need to do for this? Like it almost kicked in that animal instinct to be able to get this stuff underway. And only by the grace of God did he allow me to maybe delay my grief a little bit to help get some of those things in place. But to go back to your point, I think that's the hard part for men, is to be vulnerable, to know that it's okay that you don't have all the answers for everything. And I think, actually, I know reaching men with Red Bird has been hard. Elizabeth, you said at the beginning, mostly women reach out to do this because men, we like to feel, oh, we've got this all just, the pull yourself up by the bootstraps and move on. But all that does is end up, like you said, festering and then exhibiting itself in a very unhealthy way. So being able to accept our vulnerability as men and our need for help is not saying that we're weak. If anything, it's, showing that we're strong enough to admit that we don't have all the answers and that we need this outside help. And really at the root of that is we need God to be driving our life, not us doing it ourselves.
Brian, so powerful. But I love how you use the phrase delayed grief, because the reality is, especially when we're talking about pregnancy and infant loss, the woman really is the focal point because it's her body that is going through this process. Even when we're dealing with older losses, that maternal heart is carrying a weight that's more at the forefront. But the key is the delayed grief. So the man often has that role of supporting her and maybe of being the doer of all these things that must be done around a death. But the key is delay, not deflect. It's still, there has to be a time. There has to be a space where your grief gets to be the forefront, but it has to have its own time and space.
As a counselor, it is such a privilege to see people, but especially guys, to come into therapy and to make that space, like you said. Like it's important that they grieve too, and it is easy to kind of be in the fix it problem solver mode. But you're right, like maybe that makes sense early on when somebody needs to take care of the practicals. But again, I love what you said, Elizabeth, which is you need to prioritize your wellness too. And yes, like what you said, Brian, earlier, there's such authentic vulnerability and strength and courage that comes from opening up and grieving, and your masculine strength coming here, engaging your emotions, allowing yourself to grieve, even though it's really uncomfortable and terrifying, but look at what you're doing versus squashing it, drowning it in something else that numbs the pain.
And I think also as a woman, the husband's grief is a gift to the wife. That's something that I really experienced, that there were times my husband was so focused on taking care of me, and I was so grateful. But I also needed to be able to reach his grief. I needed to see it. I needed to see him feel it. The times where I felt like I was grieving so much more than him left me feeling a little isolated, or that we weren't on the same journey. And even though he was absolutely grieving just as much, but in such a profoundly different way, that it made us feel kind of separate at times. So, that encouragement and invitation to men, that the more you can reveal and show your grief to your wife, that's a gift to her and to your marriage.
That is something that's really important, and so many wives in particular value, is to be able to actually see that, men, you're grieving too. So it's counterintuitive. It feels like, oh, I'm just adding more emotions. I'm adding more burden to the situation. Oftentimes they're like, no, I want to see your emotions. I want to see that this is impacting you too, because otherwise it seems like you're just kind of fine. You're just okay. And that actually makes me upset and frustrated that you're not grieving. There's value. There's courage in being able to grieve with our wives and express that grief with our wives.
What about in your journey, Edward, in your marriage?
I am so incredibly grateful for the strength of my marriage with Kate and how we've really had to cling to one another. I think of, the verse about, you cling to your wife and the two of you become one flesh, and how very much we've had to cling to one another, because that's what we need to do to get through all the grief and the trauma of infertility and pregnancy loss. And so that's one of those fruits that I've seen in my marriage, is not being able to imagine what our friendship would even look like, or our marriage would even look like, if we hadn't gone through all the grief and trauma. There's a richness, there's a depth there. Our marriage is stronger because of it. But that's not to say it hasn't tried us, right? There's still been those times when it is so heavy, and, in the intensity of it, it's easy to kind of lash out, or you're hurting, so therefore you kind of speak in an irritated fashion. And so there can be hurts like that you have to apologize and kind of work through and kind of get back on the same page and be connected with each other. And so for some couples that can be really intense, and that's why couples counseling or just having outside help can really help with that when you're kind of getting stuck. So yeah, I think it's like that refiner's fire, which it really purifies. It's really intense. It hurts. It really tries your marriage at times, and things can be really rocky. But there's also that promise of purifying and getting to an even stronger and deeper place in your marriage because of it.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful invitation, and the promise, right, that the Lord will use this suffering in your marriage for healing. Finally, can we speak a little bit about the impact of your child loss on your relationship with the Lord? What has your spiritual journey been like with grief?
Definitely been challenging at times. Right after it happened, in the midst of, I would say, the heaviest part of the grief, I felt the closest to him, the closest to God that I think I'd probably felt my whole life. And at times there was why do I have to go through something like this to feel this close to you? Why can't I feel this close to you, when good things are happening? But since then, I think it's that viewpoint has matured a little bit. I've tried to reflect on those biblical stories that were great before, but now have another added level. Our Blessed Mother at the foot of the cross, those rosary reflections I shared earlier, bringing to life the darkness and the light that can come out of it. The darkest day in the history of history, we killed God on a cross. But then a couple days later, the greatest thing that ever happened in the resurrection came. And so taking our grief journey and looking at it through that lens has changed a little bit how I pray, how I relate to God and, our Blessed Mother and, what they went through.
I think about how there's been a mixture of times where the doubt, the anger, bitterness of why is this happening to us? Why is God allowing this? Has been very real, and I know it's real for many people too. Definitely has tested my faith at times, but it's also been beautiful over time to see how my faith has deepened and matured. Also through that choice of trusting in the Lord and His will, His mercy, right? That there is a purpose to this, even if it remains a mystery. I can see glimpses of purpose in it. I can see the glimpses of good that's coming into my marriage, the good that comes through my counseling work and accompanying other people. I think about the good of Red Bird Ministries and how that is all an outflowing of grief, of child loss, right? You can see glimpses of it, but it's still a mystery. We still can't see the whole big picture. So I don't want to pretend I have all the answers, but has been so helpful to kind of get to a further point along the journey where you can see pieces of it as I adjust to the grief, as you adjust to the losses, and make more sense of it, even though it's going to continue. You're going to continue to grieve for the rest of your life. You're going to continue to kind of grasp at something that's so mysterious.
Totally agree. And, something that has spoken to me, I'm not sure if you both are fans of The Chosen, but there was an episode when little James, he's limping around on his I guess his crutch, and he's healing all of these people. And there was a conversation between him and Jesus, and Jesus said, I could heal you now, but think about how powerful it is that you're healing others, yet you're not healed. So us carrying this cross of grief, like what he's been able to bring out of it, it wouldn't have manifested itself the way that it has had we not been given this cross to carry.
Sure. Yeah. The goodness of the Lord to have a vision that's so much bigger than ours. That's such an understatement. He gives us enough to carry on. He gives us more than enough to carry on. But there's always the grace and the hope for the moment. And in my experience too, and we're all speaking to this really, but the Lord gives more than He takes. Job proclaims that the Lord gives and the Lord takes, but He always gives more. And the more I really have found is Himself. He gives more of Himself, so that in the experience of whatever the suffering is, the Lord in His presence gives so much more than we can ever imagine. Well, thank you both for your vulnerability, your presence, your time, your transparency, and allowing all of our listeners, the dads out there, to really receive what the Lord is doing in and through your broken hearts. It really is a gift to all of us. So we're going to shift to our final little segment, It's Not for Nothing, where we share what is the knot that we're holding on to give us strength and hope right now, or perhaps what is the knot that leads a little bit of untying.
I would say the one that holding on to help get back up is the work with Red Bird. I mean, we just had the golf tournament. We've been preparing for this podcast. The Dad's Grief Share Night's coming up. And that being able to be a part of this group and speak to other people who are going through this, I think really, maybe I'm feeling a little down on myself or something like that. Being able to do this work and see miraculously our story help with somebody else's transformation is just, it's huge. And I think the knot right now that needs a little untying is last week we got a note from our oldest daughter's teacher that in the middle of math class she just broke down and started crying, saying she missed her brother. And that was hard because most of the time they're running around crazy and maybe driving us a little nuts. But the fact that manifested itself the way that it did after so long made me have to slow down and say, okay, where are they at? And I've tried to be more intentional of checking in with her and seeing how she's doing.
What about you, Edward? What's your knot?
I think my knot that I'm going to continue to hold on to is continuing to connect with my babies as many ways as I can. Definitely thinking about calling a parish office and submitting a mass intention this week. And, on our bedside table recently got an image of Jesus holding our babies. And so just fondly, periodically looking at that and thinking of them and talking to them. That's what I want to do a little more is talk to them personally. So I'm gonna keep holding on to that knot, trying to continue to invest in that love, because at the heart of our grief is love, right? Mm-hmm. So just continue to invest in that loving relationship that I have with them.
Gosh, that's such a beautiful way to put it, to invest in the love relationship because they're real and your fatherhood is real and it's the enduring connection. That's a huge part of our grief is how does our relationship that is not ended, it's simply changed. How does that new relationship continue to grow and evolve as we move through our stages of our lives and all the different things that happen? I think for me, I was really holding on to this new, it's not a new grief memoir, but I hadn't read it. A Grief Unveiled by Gregory Floyd is really, I think, a Catholic grief classic, but I wanted to read it in anticipation of this conversation and our men's event coming up. A Catholic father loses his son, is killed by a car in front of the house, a 6-year-old boy. And it just his exquisitely beautiful and honest journey through grief, very large family. And then the neat thing was the publisher asked him to do an update to the edition 15 years later. So it's the original memoir written probably 3 or 4 years after his child's death, and now a 15-year update of his grief, his children, the family, the marriage. And so it's been really just beautiful to just, again, dive into the work of the Lord and how he uses everything that he allows in our life for his purpose and for good, for beauty and healing and wholeness. And certainly something I've experienced in my life, but really enjoyed being uplifted by this journey. So A Grief Unveiled by Gregory Floyd, really highly recommend. So thank you both for being here. I know we touched on our upcoming Dad Support Night, A Silent Cross. It's going to be Tuesday, June 10th. It's a virtual event. So any father of loss, from pregnancy loss through adult loss, any kind of loss, you are most welcome to join us. Brian will be leading that night along with some of our other fathers of loss, Tuesday, June 10th at 7:30 Central Time. And I'll put a link to register in the show notes. It's a free registration, but just so you get the Zoom link. But you can also go to our website, redbird.love. You can find it under our virtual events, or you could do redbird.love/silent-cross. And we'd love to have you, dads of loss, in anticipation of Father's Day and the complexity of a day meant to celebrate fatherhood, but for fathers who know their fatherhood looks very different than perhaps they ever imagined. Any final thoughts? Any final words? Anything you'd like to share with our dads before we go?
Don't be afraid to reach out to somebody. As a man, we can feel like we want to do it all ourselves, but whether that's coming to the dad's retreat, getting on the app is a very easy way to get into it. And I am always open. If a dad ever wants to call me, email me, whatever, I am happy to talk to anyone about it. I promise we're not scary, and hope to see you at the dad's night here in a couple weeks.
And I would say your grief is valid. You have every right to grieve, to feel those emotions that come up because of the loss of your child. So, continue to take care of yourself, take care of your marriage. If it's helpful, seek outside support, use the grief support app. Redbird has so many resources, but you deserve support too through this, and your grief is valid.
Well, thank you both. Those are powerful words, and we're just so grateful for your time and your witness. May God be with you. And as always, Mary, untired of knots, pray for us. Thank you all. And thank you to our listeners. We pray that this conversation blesses you. And actually, this is the end of season 4. So we're going to go on a little summer hiatus, and we'll be back in the fall, in the early fall, with some new episodes. But we pray that you are well this summer and you take some time to maybe take care of yourself, take care of your grief, and catch up on It's Not for Nothing. God bless you all.
Thank you so much for joining us today. For more information on Red Bird Ministries, visit www.redbird.love. That's LOVE. Or join our free virtual community on the Red Bird app. Hope to see you there.